Today, I'm going to talk about some work that's pretty closely related to my dissertation topic, much more related than the paper I presented a couple weeks ago for those of you who were there. So I'm excited to hear what you all think. So I'm going to start by talking about an attitude that's probably pretty familiar. That's the attitude of belief. So belief is a propositional attitude that we have when we take something to be the case or regard it as true. And most epistemologists who think about belief think there are three belief-like attitudes we can take towards a proposition. We can believe it, we can withhold on it, or we can disbelieve it. There might be propositions we haven't considered or other things, but these are the three primary attitudes we take towards a proposition in the belief framework. So note, however, that we're more confident in some of our beliefs than in others, right? So I might believe that 1 + 1 = 2, and that it will snow tomorrow. These examples are a little outdated. I think I gave this talk when it was like winter in the northern Midwest. So I don't actually believe it will snow tomorrow, but let's just go with it. So I might believe both that 1 + 1 = 2 and that it will snow tomorrow. But I'm more confident that 1 + 1 = 2 than that it will snow tomorrow. And so for this reason, people think that this belief withholding disbelief story can't be the full story about what's going on in our heads. We need something more fine-grained to sort of explain how we can be more confident in some of our beliefs than others, for one. So for this reason, epistemologists often appeal to a different attitude that they call credence. So credence is also a propositional attitude, but it's something more like your confidence level or the subjective probability of P, and it's usually given a value on the interval from 0 to 1, where 0 represents sort of maximal confidence that some proposition is false, 1 represents maximal confidence that that proposition is true. So returning to our example, I might have a credence of 1 or really close to 1 that 1 + 1 = 2, but maybe a 0.9 credence that it will snow tomorrow if the forecast predicts a 90% chance of snow. Okay, so today I'm going to think mostly in terms of precise credences, but I'm also opening to extending a lot of what I'm saying to imprecise credences as well. I don't think a lot hangs on that, but I'm just going to think about precise credences primarily. Okay, so we have these beliefs on the one hand, we have credences on the other, and this raises a question. How do belief and credence relate to each other? What's the relationship between these two ways of representing or thinking about the world? And many people who have been working on this question lately have focused on what I call the reduction question. And this is a question we really focused on a lot in the pre-talk. So that question is, do either belief or credence relate to each other? And there's three main views on that question. Did I say relate? I meant to say reduce, I'm sorry. Do either belief or credence reduce to each other? Okay, so there's three main views on that question. The first is what I call a belief-first view. And on this view, beliefs are more fundamental, and credences are a species of belief. So my 0.9 credence that it will snow tomorrow, that's just a belief, and that belief has a certain probability, namely the probability that it will snow tomorrow is 0.9. So sort of all the interesting, fine-grained, and numerical features of the attitude are built into the content. This view isn't super popular. There's only a couple people defending it, but it's a view out there that is interesting. So yeah, okay. The second view is much more popular, and that's what I call the credence-first view. And on this view, credences are more fundamental, and belief is a species of credence. So many credence-firsters think that belief reduces to credence above some threshold. So as sort of a toy credence-first view, you might think belief is credence above the threshold 0.75. You believe everything, you have at least a 0.75 credence. There's other versions of this view. Some say belief's credence 1. Some say the threshold changes with stakes. Some say the threshold is the inverse of the golden ratio. We talked about that in the pre-talk. So there's different versions of the view. But the idea is that belief's just credence above some threshold. That's what it is to believe. My impression is that this view is pretty popular. I think it was the default view for a while. Dozens of defenders. I don't cite them all in your handout, but I can give you references. There's like 20+ people defending this view. Okay. The third view is the view I defend in my dissertation, and that's what I call belief-credence dualism. And this view says that belief and credence are equally fundamental, and neither attitude reduces to the other. And just as a really quick motivation why you might think this, the idea is that belief plays roles that high credences can't play. Stability, simplifying reasoning, allowing one to take a stand and have a view of the world, roles in our practices of praise and blame, We don't have time to go into all of those. We talked about some of them in more detail in the pre-talk. But the idea is that there's roles for beliefs that can't be played by high credences. And there's roles for credence that can't be played by probability beliefs. So the most common role here is explaining the actions of children and animals. A lot of people think children and animals have confidence levels, have credences. Maybe an animal is more likely to beg to you than to your friend because they think it's more likely you'll feed them. But they don't have the concept of probability and thus don't have a belief with a probabilistic content. So that's a potential role that a credence might play that a probability belief can't play, is this explanation for these unsophisticated creatures that seem like they have credences but don't have the concept of probability. Okay, so that's sort of a little bit of background on the reduction question and the debate about whether belief reduces to credence, credence reduces to belief, or neither reduces to the other. But I think the big thing I want to push today in this talk is that there's actually a lot of other questions about the relationship between belief and credence that aren't even touched on by the reduction question. And in fact, this is just skimming the surface of questions we could ask about the relationship. And one way to see this is when you think about what the dualist, the belief-credence dualist, not the mind-body dualist, the belief-credence dualist is claiming, right? They're claiming that belief doesn't reduce to credence and credence doesn't reduce to belief, but that's consistent with the idea that belief happens to always go along with credence 1, or belief happens to always go along with credence above some threshold. It's just a claim about reduction. So on your handout, I have a couple examples of views that a dualist can affirm but still be a dualist. So here's what I call the correlative belief as credence 1 view. S believes P if and only if S has credence 1 in P. And that if and only if's of correlation, not of definition. So it's not saying belief reduces to credence 1, but just that they're coextensive, right? You could also be a dualist and affirm the correlative threshold view. S believes P if and only if S has a credence in P above some threshold. There's nothing preventing a dualist from saying belief always goes along with credence above some threshold. And you could also have a correlative probability belief view, which is S has a credence of N in P if and only if S believes the probability of P is N. And you could say that's true even if beliefs, credences don't reduce to beliefs about probabilities. So on any of these views, belief and credence can be distinct and irreducible, but they just happen to go together. I'm not going to really talk a lot about the correlative probability belief view and what follows. We can talk about that in Q&A if you're interested, but I'm going to sort of focus more on the first two. But the point that a dualist can affirm any of these views suggests that there's noteworthy questions about the relationship between belief and credence that just go beyond these kind of bare questions about reduction. Okay, so for that reason, I think there's a second question about the relationship between belief and credence that we should attend to. And what I'm calling that is the independence question. And that question says, how much can belief and credence come apart? Just how independent are they? There could be tons of connections between belief and credence, even if dualism is true. And I think it initially seems pretty plausible that belief and credence would constrain each other in various ways. And I want to think about that. Is that really plausible? Could they float free from each other? Is that crazy? So I'm going to kind of look at that from two different angles. The first is what I call normative independence, and that's basically for a rational agent. How much can belief and credence come apart in various epistemic situations? And then there's just descriptive independence. It's just, as a psychological matter, rational or irrational, how much can belief and credence come apart? And if I had to say, like I have one thesis for the talk, that's the thesis that belief and credence are more independent than you might think, prima facie. So I'd like to convince you they're at least a little more independent than maybe you walked in here believing. Well, I guess that depends on what your prior beliefs and credences were about beliefs and credences, but then one might think prima facie. Okay, so I kind of have three more specific goals though, and these goals sort of structure the rest of the talk. So my first goal is I just want to carve out logical space. I want to just explore all the possible ways belief and credence come apart, and there's a big, massive chart on page 2 of your handout, so we'll get to that in a second. But second, I'm going to sort of synthesize some of the existing literature on the independence question, sort of how that fits into this chart, and then hopefully motivate some additional cases of independence that I think are at least worth thinking about, even if they're not fully convincing. And the main thing that I want to argue for today is two big upshots of this project. Okay, so one, I think plausible cases of descriptive independence support belief-credence dualism, or at least are huge problems for this credence first view that everyone's so into. I just think, if I had to take a stand anywhere, I'm going to be like, there's just things I don't know what the credence first is going to say about. I think there's some really big problems for them. So that's it's a big thing I want to push today. But secondly, I think that there's these certain popular versions of kind of moderate normative independence. And I want to argue that people that go in for those versions have reasons to actually go in for more extreme kinds of normative independence. That's not saying that normative independence is true. It's just saying if you accept these kinds of normative independence, you should accept some other kinds as well, some more extreme versions. Okay, cool. So before we jump into the talk, I just want to have a couple preliminaries. Before we jump into the chart, I just want to have a couple preliminaries about it. So 2 things about the sense of rationality I'm interested in. The first is I'm thinking about epistemic rationality rather than practical or all things considered rationality. And then second thing you might wonder about, there's rational obligations, rational permissions. So I prefer to think about the claims I'm going to make in terms of permissions. I think that makes the claims more plausible. But it's also controversial whether there are permissions in epistemology. So if you want to think about it in terms of obligations, I'm okay with that too. Okay, so this brings me to the chart. I'm going to explain it a little bit and then go into the details. Okay, so basically there's 3 sections of rows that are divided by these big black lines. Those represent the 3 belief-like attitudes you could take towards a proposition. So this top part's belief, this middle part's withholding, this bottom part's disbelief. And then what I've basically done is divided the possible creedal states into 5 categories. And I am thinking about precise credences, but I couldn't have an infinite number of rows in the chart. So I've kind of divided them into 5 categories based on roughly where the cases fit. And so the first one is going to be credence 1. The second one is a high credence that falls short of 1. The third one is a 0.5 credence. The fourth one is a low credence, but greater than 0. And the fifth one is credence 0. And so basically what I'm doing in this chart is I'm just looking at every possible combination of belief and credence, whether it's rationally possible and then whether it's psychologically possible. And that's what these 2, I always get columns and rows mixed up. It's so, okay, that's what these 2 columns correspond to. The first column's whether it's rationally possible, the second column is whether it's psychologically possible. Okay. And then finally, the gray areas, these ones I've kind of grayed out, those are ones that are pretty uncontroversial. The ones that most people think they're psychologically and normatively possible. So kind of the boring ones. Okay, one more thing before we jump in. So my goal here is not to defend that there is definitely 100% for sure cases that fall in every single box of this chart. That's not my goal. My goal is more exploratory. It's sort of saying, look, if there were cases that fall into these boxes, what would they be? What are the possibilities? What are the most plausible things that could fit into those possibilities? And then at the end, I'm going to argue for those 2 controversial upshots that I talked about at the beginning. The first was that credence first is false, basically. And the second was that if you accept some normative independence, you should accept more. But there's like a row on this chart where it's like belief in credence 0. My main goal in this talk isn't to argue that we can rationally believe things that we have credence 0 in, although I think it's like, there's some interesting cases, But my main goal is these 2 other things, the anti-credence first goal and then some normative independence gives us more normative independence. So I just want to emphasize that because I had audiences that were like, really not having it, and I was like, that's not what I'm trying to argue when I presented this in the past. Okay, cool. So now let's talk about the chart. So the first 2, 1 and 2, the first 2 rows, that's believing something and having a credence of 1 in it, and believing something and having a high credence that falls short of 1 in it. Those are both pretty commonly accepted. I mean, of course, there's people that think belief is credence 1, or there's people that think, well, you could think at least that rational belief requires credence 1. So some people would maybe deny that there's cases of row 2, but most people probably think these are relatively common, uninteresting cases. Okay, so now we've talked about some uninteresting cases, and now I'm just going to jump straight into the most controversial row probably. So that's cases where you believe P. So I'm going to sort of lump 3 and 4 together because they're actually kind of the same cases, depending on how you spell them out. you believe P and have a 0.5 credence in P, or you believe P and have a low credence in P that's greater than 0. Okay, so the first case is familiar to some of us. We talked about this in the pre-talk also. That's the preface paradox. So you write a book, you believe every claim in your book, and given a basic closure principle, you believe the conjunction of the claims in your book, but you're also aware of your own fallibility. And so your credence in the conjunction of all the claims in your book is quite low. And depending on how fallible you think you are and how long the book is, your credence could be 0.5 or lower. So one kind of interpretation of certain preface cases is that it's rational to believe P, where P is the conjunction of all the claims in the book you've just written, even though your credence in P is 0.5 or lower. And I'm not trying to necessarily make a sustained defense of this, and I don't have time to make a sustained defense of this, but Martin Smith has this new book. It's called Between Probability and Certainty, and this is his reading of the preface paradox, and he defends it in great detail. So you can go look at that book if you want to hear more about why this is the best way to read the preface paradox. And again, I'm not saying this is the best way. I'm just saying, here's an interesting case. Maybe this is one where you could believe and have the lowest credence. Okay, so that's case 1. Here's case 2. Suppose a student walks into your introduction to philosophy class believing they have hands, believing there's an external world, believing the future will be like the past. Then, in class, you discuss Descartes and Hume, and the student is moved by their arguments for skepticism. The student drastically decreases their confidence that they have hands, but they don't cease believing they have hands, even though, given these arguments, their credence they have hands is less than 0.5. You might think it's not totally obvious the student's being irrational, and that in cases of doubting generally, maybe our credence could lower without forcing us to give up our beliefs. So that's another case. Doubting, being primed with skepticism, that's a potential case. Okay, here's a third case. It's from a paper by John Hawthorne, who was here last week, and some other people. It's called Belief is Weak. So here's the case. Suppose you're at the horse races, and there's a 3-horse race, and horse A is 48% likely to win, horse B is 28% likely to win, and horse C is 27% likely to win. Hawthorne et al. Argues that it could be rational for you to believe horse A will win for something like the fact that A is the most likely of the salient alternatives. And I think you can think this is convincing without being committed to a general principle that says it's always rational to believe the most likely salient alternative. You could just say, in some cases it is, and this is one of them. And it's interesting because that might even be true, even if your credence is at 0.5 or lower. So that's a case from Hawthorne. Okay, the fourth case is another case that's also discussed by Martin Smith in this book, Between Probability and Certainty. And so some of you might be familiar with the blue bus cases. I don't know if any of you are familiar. We're going to talk about those in a second. This is the inverse of the blue bus case. So here's the case. It's a case where you learn of a base rate, or you get some statistical evidence against some proposition, a proposition that you previously had really good evidence for. So Smith argues in these cases, you can rationally believe a proposition even if you have a low credence in it. So here's a more concrete example. Suppose a bus hits someone on a busy street, and you have good testimonial evidence that the bus is owned by the blue bus company. But then you learn that on that day, only 5% of the buses operating in that part of town were owned by the blue bus company. This doesn't seem like a reason that forces you to give up your belief the blue bus company was responsible. After all, you have this reliable testimonial evidence that supports this proposition. But learning this statistic affects the probability that the blue bus company was responsible. So we can actually just do some math, and if we suppose the eyewitness is 85% reliable and 5% of the buses are owned by the blue bus company, you can use a Bayesian likelihood and just calculate the probability the blue bus company did it, and it comes out to be about 0.23. So we're going to talk about the flip version of that case in a second, but those are cases where it seems like you can believe something even if you have a low credence in it. Okay, so like I said, that's probably the most controversial box. And I don't know if I'm fully convinced by all those cases, but I think they're at least interesting and worth thinking more about. Okay, now let's move to 3 and 4, but the descriptive cases. So now we're just thinking about what is psychologically possible, not thinking about epistemic rationality anymore. Okay, so I think there are cases of double-mindedness that are really compelling cases where you can believe and have a low credence in something. So consider this case. Jim is a paranoid and jealous person. He's worried that his partner's cheating on him, and he finds himself believing she's been unfaithful. When asked about his evidence for this belief, it's minimal. He acknowledges that the probability that she's cheating is actually quite low, and thus he's not at all confident that she's cheating. But he's very attached to her, and he has this paranoid and jealous personality. And so as a result, he's sort of experiencing a bit of cognitive dissonance. He just can't shake this belief, even though he acknowledges that this belief is very unlikely to be true. So I actually think cases of double-mindedness like this aren't uncommon. Sometimes we find ourselves with a belief that's based on wishful thinking, paranoia, self-deception, etc. And we know that belief's pretty unlikely to be true. So if we know P is unlikely in our evidence, in many cases we'll have a low credence in P. Thus, it seems psychologically possible to both believe P and have a low credence in P. And you don't even have to say that you can have them both be occurrent at the same time. You can say, like, sometimes in one frame of mind you believe it, and in another frame of mind you have a low credence in it, and maybe you can't always put those together, have them be occurrent at the same time. But, many epistemologists think you can believe a contradiction even if you can't put that contradiction together, so I don't see why we can't also believe something and have a low credence in it. So that's one case that I think is pretty compelling. Here's another case that I also think is pretty compelling. So cases where agents believe of themselves that this combination of doxastic attitudes is an appropriate response to their evidence. So we can think about Martin Smith, right? He has this 2016 book that he wrote. He might think that the best response to his evidence is to believe the conjunction of all the claims in his book and have a low credence in it. He's argued that that's how we should respond to preface paradoxes. And sure, maybe he's totally wrong about the preface paradox. Maybe that combination of attitudes is irrational. But I don't see how you can deny that it's psychologically possible for him to have that combination of attitudes, especially because he thinks that's the correct response to his evidence. So cases where an agent thinks they're genuinely doing the right thing, those seem like cases where it's psychologically possible to, e.g., have a belief in the low credence, even if they're wrong about rationality. Finally, you could take a variation of the doubt case that I gave with the student who you're giving the arguments for skepticism, and you might say, yeah, that student's being irrational, but still they could not give up this belief they have hands, but not be very confident in it. Maybe they can't give up the belief, but their credence is pretty low. So even if you think there's no way that student's rational, still seems like that's psychologically possible. Okay, so now we've talked about 3 and 4, rational psychological possibility. Okay, now I want to talk about believing something and having a 0 credence in it. Actually, this is probably the most controversial one. So here's a couple cases where you might think this is rational. Suppose you write a book that's infinitely long, contains an infinite number of propositions. If that's impossible, consider all of your beliefs. If you don't have an infinite number of beliefs, then consider all the propositions you're disposed to believe. So in these cases, there's a large conjunction that you plausibly believe or are disposed to believe, but since it's infinitely large, you should assign it a 0 credence. Nonetheless, you believe it. So it's like an infinite preface case. That's one potential case. Here's another case from Sarah Moss's book, Probabilistic Knowledge. So she is thinking about throwing a dart at a dartboard with an incountably infinite number of points, where the bullseye is one of those points. So you might believe the proposition, the dart might hit the bullseye, so the might is part of the proposition. You believe it might hit the bullseye, but you assign that proposition credence 0. So again, this is one of those things we're going to say, look at her book for a longer defense of this, but there's these infinite cases where you might think you could rationally believe something and assign it credence 0. One natural response to this is to try to appeal to infinitesimal credences. Some people do that. I guess here I'm just willing to sort of assume that we don't or shouldn't have infinitesimal credences, but if you're really not happy with that, still this gets us really radical independence, right? You're believing it and you have an infinitesimally small credence, so that's still a pretty extreme claim. So even if you don't have credence 0, you can still have an infinitesimally small credence in these cases. Okay. And then again, so on the descriptive cases, I think again considerations from double-mindedness provide a reason to think it's psychologically possible to believe P and have a credence 0 in it, even if the states can't be occurrent at the same time. So yeah, I won't rehearse that argument, but it's kind of the same one as that we already talked about. Okay, so now I'm going to move to withholding belief. So withholding belief is basically being in a state where you haven't made up your mind about whether P. It's the attitude many of us take to propositions like this coin will land heads or there's an even number of stars. So that's withholding belief. So when could we withhold belief in some proposition but have credence 1 in it? Well, there's a variation of Moss's dart case that would be one. So a rational agent would have credence 1 in the proposition the dart will not hit the bullseye because there's kind of an infinite number of possibilities there. So the negation is in the proposition the dart will not hit the bullseye. But withhold belief on that proposition because that's kind of hitting the bullseye is sort of a live possibility for that agent. So that's a version of Moss's case that's defended in her book where you can get withholding in credence 1. There's another paper, though, by Jane Friedman. I don't know if any of you know it. It's called Rational Agnosticism and Degrees of Belief. And I think it's a cool paper. Basically, she argues that withholding belief is consistent with all standard credences, including 1 and 0. So here's how. She says, take an ordinary contingent proposition that you have no evidence for or against. And then she argues for this thing she calls the absence of evidence norm. Basically, if you have no evidence for or against some ordinary contingent proposition, then you can suspend judgment about it rationally. So we have these propositions that we're suspending judgment about. Well, what we do is we put them in strings of conjunctions and strings of disjunctions. And as the conjunction gets longer, our credence gets lower. As the disjunction gets longer, our credence gets higher. But there are these strings of propositions that we're withholding belief about. And given the absence of evidence norm, it's rationally permissible to withhold belief on the string, even though your credence, I forget what the number is, but it's like just 10 of them, and your credence is like 0.1 or something. I mean, it goes down really fast. So that's that wouldn't get us to, the finite strings wouldn't get us to credence 1 or credence 0, but she thinks there can be cases of infinite strings that do get us withholding consistent with credence 1 or credence 0. So here's some examples. You might have credence 1 but suspend judgment on propositions like the following. The length of the tail of the oldest cat in the world is not in. The president's credence it will rain tomorrow is not in, or the number of birds in France is not in. So these are cases where you should have credence 1 in the proposition, but it seems like you should withhold belief because it's one of these sort of ordinary contingent propositions. Okay, so that's withholding in credence 1. Now, and again, we can get similar cases of descriptive independence, kind of the same argument. If you're really into the infinitesimal thing, you could say, look, maybe infinitesimals are rationally required, but some people might still have credence 1 in them anyway, if they're convinced that's the right response to the evidence. So I think we can, again, get the descriptive independence going. Now I want to talk about 7. So 7 is an interesting row because super popular in the literature. People are really into this. And these are cases where you withhold belief, but you have a high credence that falls short of 1. Okay, so I'm going to start with a really basic case and then kind of ramp up to some of the other cases people give to motivate this. Let's just take a case where you're rolling a fair 6-sided die. Should you believe it won't land a 6? Well, a lot of people say, no, you shouldn't believe it won't land a 6. That's kind of a live possibility for you. But your credence that it won't land a 6 should be pretty high, about 0.83. And as you add more sides to the die, or you start rolling 2 die, you should start, you can rationally withhold belief even though your credence gets higher and higher. Shout out to everyone I was playing Catan with this weekend. We were rolling a lot of dice. So it's a really basic case where it seems like withholding belief is consistent with pretty high credences. Another case that's probably familiar to a lot of people is the lottery case. So take the proposition, your ticket will lose. Let's say you have a lottery ticket and you're trying to decide whether your ticket will lose. A lot of people think you should withhold belief that your ticket will lose. You can think about the live possibility thing, but I also think we can give some arguments that you should withhold belief that your ticket will lose. Here's one. Knowledge is the norm of belief. You can't know your ticket will lose, therefore you shouldn't believe your ticket will lose. Here's another. If you believe your ticket will lose, presumably there's nothing special about your ticket, right? So there's no reason why you shouldn't believe that every ticket will lose. But by a basic closure principle, then you believe the conjunction, ticket 1 will lose, ticket 2 will lose, ticket 3 will lose, ticket n will lose. And you obviously believe the negation of that conjunction because one ticket will win. So we have to reject one of the 4 premises of the argument I just gave. And a natural one to reject is the proposition you should believe your ticket will lose. So lottery cases are another one where it seems like you can have a high credence, but you should withhold belief. So I talked about the blue bus cases earlier. This is the more sort of traditional version of those cases. I'm going to give a slightly different variation that Laura Bouchat gives in one of her papers. So say I leave my cell phone on the table, I go to the bathroom during the break, and I come back and someone stole it, and I somehow know that either Julia or Ben stole it. Maybe they were the only 2 people in the room because everyone else just went to the bathroom, and I'm like, it's either Julia or Ben, it has to be, right? And let's say I also know that men are 10 times more likely to steal cell phones than women. That's made up. Ben's like, yep, they are. But you're incriminating yourself, Ben. No, men are 10 times more likely to steal cell phones than women. Let's just say I only know that statistic, right? I should have a high-ish credence that Ben stole it, like 0.91. But that statistic isn't really incriminating Ben in particular. And a lot of people think we shouldn't believe people, we shouldn't form beliefs on the basis of mere statistical evidence. So this is a case, again, where I have a high-ish credence Ben stole my cell phone, but I shouldn't believe Ben stole it. Okay, and then the final case is these Friedman cases, and these are like the less weird ones. They're just cases where you have a bunch of withholdings, and then you have a really big disjunction of them. Your credence in the disjunction is high, but nonetheless you withhold belief in the disjunction. Okay. And I'm starting to sound like a repetitive person. Again, these cases seem psychologically possible, even if not rational. A lot of people think this is the correct response to their evidence. It's hard to say that people psychologically can't have these combinations of states. Okay, so that's 7. Row 8 is a boring row where you're withholding belief that P and your credence in P is 0.5. You might also think it's boring if your credence is close to 0.5. Those are kind of not super interesting cases. And now I'm going to do a trick that makes my talk shorter, which is take everything I just said, negate it, and then that's the whole bottom half of the chart. So I don't have to go through all of that. So you might notice rows 3 and 13 correspond, rows 4 and 12 correspond, rows 5 and 11, you get the point. So I don't need to, if you were just totally convinced by everything I just said, which obviously you all were, then you're convinced by the rest of the chart, because you just have to put negations in front of all the propositions I just talked about. So that's cool. So the main point I want to drive home is you can resist me on some of the normative stuff, although I think some of it's kind of interesting and compelling, but I think the descriptive stuff's really hard to deny. Okay. 33. I might make it on 45. Hope so. Okay. So now I want to basically talk about a bunch of upshots that come out of this kind of picture. Like, what does this mean? What should we conclude from this? What does this tell us about the relationship between belief and credence? What does this tell us about the reduction question? What are some upshots? Okay. First, I want to talk about some normative stuff. So if you're convinced by these cases, if you think belief and credence are sort of normatively independent, even in just some of the ways I've talked about, one thing you might think, and this is something Laura Bouchat also argues for in her paper Belief, Credence, and Norms, is that rational belief and rational credence are sensitive to different features or parts of a body of evidence. And it's really tricky spelling out exactly what those features of a body of evidence are. But you might think, at the very least, rational credences conforms to known epistemic probabilities. So if you know the epistemic probability of P is N, then you should have a credence of N and P. Rational belief, however, is different. And spelling out exactly what's going on with rational belief is tough, but one kind of prima facie suggestion is that it's in some way sensitive to which possibilities are live or made live by your evidence. And there's different views of kind of what's going on in these cases in the literature. A lot of the authors I've been talking about suggest different versions. So Laura Bushak has one. Martin Smith has one called the normative support view that I think is pretty cool. If you guys are interested in it, check out, he has a couple papers in the book kind of defending this view. I have a view in a synthèse paper that is kind of about the salience of the possibilities, what possibilities evidence makes salient. I also think Renee is interested in some of these cases and has some papers on this, and she might be another person you can kind of check out for the ways that belief and credence might be sort of sensitive to different features of evidence. So that's kind of a big picture point that I think is plausible if you kind of buy these cases that I'm talking about. So now some things I want to argue for. So the first thing I want to argue for is that a commitment to minimal normative independence, that's pretty popular right now, pushes us to accept more radical normative independence. So I talked about these cases, people are really into them. You withhold belief, but you have a high credence. Blue bus cases, the dice case, the lottery case. And I think insofar as you buy these cases, you're committed to the idea that withholding belief is rationally consistent with all credences on the interval from 0 to 1, not including 1 and 0. So maximally high, maximally low, because you just do the negation thing. And people, that's kind of an obvious point, but besides Jane Freeman, I don't know anyone that's actually explicit about this. And that's like a semi-radical form of independence. Withholding is consistent with all credences except for potentially 1 and 0. So less controversial, maybe obvious point, but I think someone just needs to kind of say it, because it's true. The second thing that I think is a little more controversial, but I still think is plausible, is people that are into these kind of withholding belief and high credence cases, I think they face pressure to accept even more radical versions of normative independence, like maybe cases of belief with credence below 0.5, something like that. And there's two reasons I think this. So one, we've established that these people are committed to the view that withholding belief is consistent with all standard credences on the 0 to 1 interval, not including 0 to 1. So what's special about withholding? If we already think rational agnosticism is consistent with this big range of credences, why is belief or disbelief different? I'm not going to rule out, there could be a good answer to this. I'm not necessarily trying to rule that out. I'm just saying no one's really talking about this. This hasn't been addressed in literature so far. And I think once we kind of admit that belief and credence are normatively independent to an extent, it's sort of hard to contain that without our view starting to look ad hoc. So that's point one. Point two is, I think once we sort of consider these general principles that might govern rational belief and rational credence formation, then it is hard to see how we don't get a more radical normative independence going. So like I mentioned just a second ago, you might think rational belief and rational credence are sensitive to different features of the body of evidence. And so on this view, like the kind of evidence you have, not just the amount, matters. Excuse me. And if you think that, then a more radical version of belief credence independence seems to follow. And so on this sort of view, I think it's natural to think you could rationally believe P and have a lowish credence in P because the states are sensitive to different features of a body of evidence. So I do think if people want to go in for a little bit of normative independence, but not a lot, they at least need to tell me how they're containing it. How are you just getting, these small range of cases and not getting more? So that's sort of the first point I want to push. I think at least if you're committed to really moderate normative independence, there's some work you need to do. Okay, so that's some normative issues. Now let's move to two descriptive issues. So we talked about, these cases of normative independence, they're pretty controversial, but descriptive independence seems pretty plausible due to, one, these cases of double-mindedness when, as a result of wishful thinking, paranoia, or self-deception, you believe P and have a low credence in P, or you disbelieve P and have a high credence in P. We didn't explicitly talk about that, but it also motivates those kinds of cases. So that's one reason. And two, agents genuinely believe they're doing the epistemically rational thing. And if they genuinely believe it, even if they're wrong about epistemic rationality, it still seems like they can be in those states psychologically. Okay, I think this creates really bad problems for a credence first view. Here's why. So two main questions I have for the credence firsters out there in the audience. The first is, on a credence first view, how can we believe P and have a low credence in P? So if belief just is credence above some threshold, what constitutes the belief? You have a super low credence. It's not at all clear how a credence first view can explain the possibility of believing P with a low credence in P. Thought about this a lot. Here's a suggestion. It's a little crazy, but we gotta think about what they might say. Maybe you have two credences towards the same proposition, one high and one low. That's weird. No, I don't know. There's one paper by Blake Raber where he has one footnote where he has like one sentence about this. That's the only person I know that's ever talked about this in the literature. No one's talking about this. And I have some concerns. So one, is that even possible? Can you have two credences towards the same proposition at the same time? I don't know. But then two, is this actually a plausible description of what's going on in these cases? I mean, in these cases, it seems like there's someone, and they're just like, they have this commitment to the world as being a certain way, even though they think it's 5 minutes, cool. Even though they think it's like really unlikely. And it seems like they just believe something, even though they have a low credence in it. And I don't know if, at least phenomenologically, that's going to be a good description of the cases, or at least of all of the cases. So this is a way you could maybe try to go, but I'm not super sanguine about it. I actually think the second problem is maybe even worse for them, though, and that's this. So on the credence first view, how can agents withhold belief that P and have a high credence in P? So our cell phone case, lottery cases, dice cases, these are supposed to be cases where you're withholding belief that P, but you have a high credence in P, right? So what the heck is going on? I mean, the high credence is supposed to constitute a belief, right? But you're withholding belief. I mean, that's just part of the case. And again, I mean, you can maybe try to do a similar sort of move to the one I just talked about. Well, do they both withhold belief that P and believe P at the same time? And then they're withholding, but then their high credence is also constituting this belief. I mean, that's just really weird. Like, again, no one's really talking about that. And the whole point of these cases is that you don't believe P, right? I don't believe Ben stole my cell phone. I just think it's likely. I just have a high credence, And so that's like totally missing the point of the cases. And then just to tell me that like this is an impossible combination of states to be in, and like Laura Bouchak genuinely can't, she's like totally self-deceived and like can't be in, sorry, getting on a soapbox. I don't buy it. So anyway, I'll move on. So I think dualism is going to be the best explanation for these cases of descriptive independence. I think things aren't like fatal for the belief first view, but the belief first view is going to require an explicit probability belief for every credence. And so I think that's going to make it harder to get the cases of descriptive independence off the ground. It's going to be a little less psychologically realistic. I mean, yeah, I don't think that's nearly as fatal as these problems for the credence first view, though. So dualism is the best explanation, but credence first is definitely false. Okay. 3 minutes? Yeah? Okay. I want to talk about like 2 other things, and I'll skip some stuff. So the third is some implications this has for some other debates in epistemology. So if I'm right about independence, and especially if you think there's a certain kind of normative independence between belief and credence, I think this makes space for some really interesting answers to some recent debates in epistemology. And I'm just going to give one example, and we can talk about some others in Q&A if you want. So take the disagreement debate. So disagreement debate, we have this thing, it's called an epistemic peer, basically someone who's kind of equally as likely to get a question right as you. They're kind of epistemically on a par with you, right? There's debate when we encounter someone who's an epistemic peer who disagrees with us, how should we change our opinions? And there's 2 main views. Conciliationists say we should alter our opinions in some way, presumably kind of closer to the opinions of our peer. Maybe not always. I know there's that Christensen case, if any of you are thinking of that, so maybe not always, but often. And then the steadfaster says, no, when we encounter a disagreeing peer, we don't have to change our opinion. We can kind of remain steadfast, even in light of disagreement. And what's interesting about belief, credence, independence, well, one thing you might note is I haven't used belief and credence at all when describing this, and there's a big question. Does this apply to our beliefs, credences, both? I mean, like, I don't know. And one thing to note is if you already think there's a level of normative independence between belief and credence, then you can actually kind of get combinations of conciliationism and steadfastness that are really interesting. And my favorite one is conciliationism about credences, but a steadfast view of belief. And Actually, Laura Bouchak has an unpublished manuscript where she's arguing for this view. But the idea is that when I encounter a disagreeing peer, I should lower my confidence once I realize that they're a peer and they disagree with me. But nonetheless, I can kind of continue in my convictions and I can remain steadfast in my beliefs, even if I'm slightly less confident. And then depending on how much normative independence you want to go in for, my credences can get really low without having to give up my beliefs. Or you might not want to go in for that much, then they can just get low to a certain extent. Part of the reason I like this is because in the disagreement debate, I think credences are much more conducive to conciliation than beliefs. Because if you are my peer and you believe P and I withhold, then it's not really clear what attitude, there's not an intermediary attitude. So you might think, well, you should just believe probably P, but what attitude should I take towards P? There's not really a clear way that conciliation works. In a lot of these cases of the belief framework, the only case that really makes sense is if you believe P and I disbelieve P. But in the credence framework, there's just it's a lot more fine-grained, so it's a lot more flexible. You can kind of explain how the conciliation is supposed to work, but also capture this idea that I can have political views and moral views and religious views, even though I know there's a ton of smart people that disagree with me. So I think that's sort of cool. You can kind of capture what's intuitive about both views in the disagreement debate if you can go in for this normative independence. And obviously, there's other combinations too. You could try to get conciliationism about belief, but steadfast about credence going. I don't like that view as much, but you can try. And then for the sake of time, I'm going to skip the next two, but similar kind of things apply in the permissivism debate, the pragmatic encroachment debate, and probably other debates as well. I'm almost done. Okay. So finally, I want to address, more just flag, potential challenge, I guess, for people that like this kind of independence. Smiley face? Oh, smiley face, great. I'm almost done. So the challenge is, what kind of mental and actional profiles are people going to have when their beliefs and their credences kind of come apart, especially come apart radically? So here's a question. Let's say I believe P and have a low credence in P. Well, am I going to act as if P? Am I going to act differently if I have a high credence in P and disbelieve P? I mean, we can think back to kind of our jealous spouse to maybe help make a little bit of progress on this question. Maybe they're torn, maybe depending on what frame of mind they're acting in different ways, but it does seem like there's a bit of instability there, and if we want to say this is possibly rational, that's where things start to get a little murky. That's where I start to get a little bit worried. Some people, though, think that imprecise credences can be rational, and even really big ranges of imprecise credences. So in the pre-talk, we were talking about this case, what's your credence that your neighbor's going to wear a red shirt tomorrow? And you might be like, well, it's somewhere between 0.9 and 0.1, and I don't really know, So one way we can kind of start to maybe deal with this is sort of look at the imprecise credence literature. What do they say about the mental and actional profile of people? And then sort of borrow that for these, if we want to sort of push that you can be rational to believe something and have a low credence. And maybe that means you'll sort of accept all bets consistent with that range. I mean, if you want to cash out in terms of betting behavior, which I'm not really into, but that's a possibility. Another worry here is you might think this allows you to utter really problematic Moraine sentences. So I believe P, but the probability P is really unlikely, something like that. I want to think more about that. Again, I'm not really fully committing to all these states being rational. But I think it would be cool if we could kind of get that off the ground more, just because I think there is some cool work it can do. But I am sort of worried about these Moraine sentences, and I'm not sure what to say. So if you want to help me in Q&A and tell me something I could say about that, that would be great. I feel like in other Q&As, people have just been like, this is crazy. You utter all these crazy things. So here's another question. What's the difference between someone who believes P with a 0.7 credence in P and someone who withholds belief that P with a 0.7 credence in P? That's an interesting question. And I think kind of the answer to that question and just what do agents who believe propositions and have low credences look like will partially depend on what we say about this thing that's called the Bayesian challenge. The Bayesian challenge is basically like, look, why would we have both beliefs and credences, especially if they can have the same proposition? It seems like that's just really complicated, and either one's going to be superfluous or it's going to lead us in the wrong direction. And so the dualist needs to give an account of that anyway. I haven't had time to give my answer to the Bayesian challenge, but although people in the pre-talk had a bit of a preview of that. But whatever we say about the Bayesian challenge, we might be able to kind of make progress on what the profile of these agents, whose beliefs and credences come apart, look like. So, one thing I think is that depending on the stakes, we might rely on our belief or rely on our credence. So it might be that, like, in certain circumstances they'd rely on their belief, and in certain circumstances they'd rely on their credence. And I do want to note there are cases where the ability to sort of see a situation from two different perspectives can be epistemically and practically beneficial. So maybe there are good things about being able to believe something and have a little credence in it. But again, that's pretty underdeveloped, and this is just a lot of open questions I have. So yeah, thanks for coming.